We see it in our news feeds, but we think, oh, that's other people. We don't have to worry about that. We'll be okay type things. And one of the themes I was thinking about this discussion was, how do I get my photography to engage with some of that stuff? And the biggest problem really for me is that I live in an academic ecosystem where the focus is on publish or perish in big peer-reviewed journals. They're text-based outputs. They're not really interested in images. And yet I think there's so much that images about this issue and the environment could do in communicating this.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 395 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. Today's guest is Chris Wright, a university professor, author, and landscape photographer from Sydney, Australia. Chris's research explores organizational and societal responses to climate change, focusing on how business organizations interpret and respond to the climate crisis. He has published extensively on issues of corporate environmentalism, corporate citizenship, organizational justification and compromise, risk, identity, and future imaginings. His goal is to marry his research on climate with his approach to photography, which is the main topic that we explore on today's podcast. Okay, let's get to this week's conversation with Chris Wright. All right, Chris Wright, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here. Real honor. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. I always listen when our friends from Down Under recommend somebody, and here we are with another Australian guest.
Yeah, no, as I was saying, there's a few of us down under doing photography, so it's great to be joining that pantheon of well-known photographers. Not that I'm that well-known, but anyway, yeah, it's good fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, for people who aren't familiar with you and your photography, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an enthusiast landscape nature photographer. I live on the northern beaches of Sydney, Australia. So Sydney's a sort of largest city in Australia. I have a real strong interest and passion in nature and the environment, and that sort of guides a lot of my photography. And that's also part of day job, essentially, that I'm a university professor at the University of Sydney. And for the last 20 years or more, I've been studying climate change and biodiversity collapse and all of that pretty grim environmental news in my research and my teaching. And I'm at a stage, I guess, the last sort of 4 or 5 years of trying to marry my personal interest in photography with my professional interests in these issues. And as we'll probably discuss in the conversation, that's taken various forms. But yeah, so I live in a part of the world, very lucky, northern beaches of Sydney, fantastic oceans, beaches, headlands, 5 minutes from where I live, bushland. We have a national park right next to us. I live here with my family, my wife, 2 children. Yeah, so that's me. So I'm sort of living in a very marvelous part of the world in terms of landscape and nature, and that's sort of driven my interest in photography.
Love it. And how did you first get into photography? What was the impetus behind that? Yeah,
so I grew up in Sydney by the harbour, Sydney Harbour, by the ocean. A lot of my childhood and teenage years were focused very much on the ocean, the harbour, the sea. I had a strong passion as a teenager, early 20s in sports fishing. So I did awful lot of fishing from the shore and boats. I travelled to some pretty exotic places, the northern regions of Australia, Northern Territory, Arnhem Land, New Guinea, New Britain, pursuing big fish. And there was always a camera there. So I always had a camera to sort of record captures and record scenes. And as I sort of developed that, a lot of those photos ended up in fishing magazines, actually, on the covers of fishing magazines, blokes holding big fish, basically. Nothing too creative or artistic there. But, you know, I and friends who were sort of semi-professional, I guess, in the sort of journalism, fishing journalism sort of space, we'd all have SLR cameras back then. This was the 80s, early 80s, mid 80s. And we were all shooting slide film, you know, Fuji Velvia and Kodachrome 64 and all that stuff. And so, yeah, that was the early introduction to photography. And then as my career developed, the photography sort of dropped back into the background, and I had a PhD and I landed a university job and sort of started climbing the hierarchy. And one of the benefits of that, of course, is that as an academic, you're encouraged, particularly in your early years, to travel a lot and go to conferences and network. So I got to visit many of the big cities in the United States and on Europe, in Asia. And I'd have a little point and shoot camera with me, a little Canon point and shoot. And this was sort of late 2000s, 2010s, mirrorless cameras were sort of coming in, or digital cameras were coming in. And so I was taking a lot of photos of these places, just sort of travel shots, basically, nothing particularly artistic there. Around 2015, I went to a conference in Athens in Greece. It was July. It was I didn't realize it at the time, I'd read about it, was the eve of the Grexit vote, where the Athenians or Greeks were voting to decide whether they stayed in the EU or not. And I arrived in Athens in a hotel, turned on the BBC News, and there was this news about this massive protest in Syntagma Square with about 50,000 people there. And I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. Where's this? And realized it was like 50 meters behind my hotel. So I grabbed the camera, went down there every night that week. I did the conference during the day, but every night that week I'd be in Syntagma Square sort of doing street photography of people. And I'd bought a semi-serious camera in anticipation of that trip, a little Olympus EM1, I think it was, and a 24-70 equivalent sort of zoom lens. And I was just absolutely hooked. It was just a week of photographing people, photographing democracy in action, protests, riot police, tear gas, the whole thing. It was fantastic. And really after that, my interest in photography just accelerated, and I went down the rabbit hole and YouTube University and bought photo courses and bought more cameras and more lenses, and it just accelerated. Learn about RAW, learn about post-processing, learn about rules of composition, and it's really gone from there. And I guess since that time, my interests, as I was saying earlier, have sort of pivoted towards nature and landscape much more than the sort of the street photography, photojournalism sort of stuff. That was sort of accelerated during COVID, I guess, because there were limits on what you could do. And all around us here, we've got nature, we've got the ocean, we've got waterfalls. So even though it was lockdown, we were very spoilt because I could go within about a 5-mile radius, and there's just fantastic landscape to photograph. And that's sort of where it's gone. Yeah.
Nice. And you mentioned YouTube University. Is there, because the funny thing about YouTube is there's a lot of amazing stuff on YouTube, but it's hard to, like, if you're not an expert in photography, it's hard to know what's legit versus just noise. And, a lot of clickbait and a lot of people talking like they know what they're talking about, but you don't really know unless you've been doing photography for a while. So I'm curious, like, in looking in the rearview mirror, were there certain YouTube channels that kind of speak back to you in terms of like being really helpful or useful? Yeah,
I'm trying to think back now. I mean, I made not so much mistakes, but I sort of committed to particular voices on YouTube photography that in retrospect probably weren't great decisions around, the adoption of almost template photography. You buy a preset and you just apply it to everything, and you end up with, in retrospect, pretty ghastly sort of results. But in the process of doing that, you learn through mistakes. So, it's serendipity. You sort of delve into the social media and you speak to people and you meet people when you're out shooting, and you talk to them about who they look at and who they speak to. And gradually, learning by doing essentially is what's happening. Is sort of trial and error. You learn who are the better, wiser potential photographers' voices. I bought a number of courses. I bought some of Will Patino's courses, and I ended up doing a workshop with him in New Zealand. And I think he's just got so much wisdom to impart about photography, particularly landscape photography. So he was someone I learned a lot from. I mean, on the post-processing side, it was sort of interesting because early on, I was just sort of using Lightroom in a very rudimentary way. And Photoshop was always this, looked kind of scary, complex sort of software. And I think I ran into someone at a photo shoot at a local beach who was a full-on Photoshop guru who'd done the whole thing. And he said, oh, you should check out, there was a particular group who had a sort of an online course about how to use Photoshop for post-processing. And that was a real eye-opener. I bought that course, and suddenly my whole workflow changed a little bit in Lightroom, go into Photoshop to do the heavy lifting, all of that stuff, and then come back into Lightroom. So that's sort of, it's been a learning evolution process. But yeah, in terms of getting back to the question, where do you look on social media? You really have to just sort of try a lot, and you realize over time what is rubbish and what is more profound.
And it's not always correlated with the people who have the most subscribers.
No, that's true. Yes, well, I learned that. Yeah.
We'll just leave it at that.
Yes, let's do that.
All right, Chris. Well, so one of the things that really stood out to me when I was looking through your website and looking at your images, in particular, something that generated a lot of jealousy on my part, is the fact that you have this huge gallery of really beautiful seascape images. I personally really love seascapes, but I live in the middle of the country in Colorado, and it's not super often that I find myself on the coast. And whenever I do, though, I'm like, oh, I got to do some seascape work. Tell me why you're so drawn to photographing wide-angle seascapes particularly.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I live in a part of the world where the Pacific Ocean is 5 minutes away. I live at a beach called Narrabeen. North Narrabeen is one of the big surf locations around the world. We have the international surf tournaments here. There are beaches within probably a 10-15 minute walk, couple of minutes drive from me that people from all over Sydney come to. They drive for 2 hours to get to some of these beaches because they're one in particular is my local I shoot a lot of. You've probably seen a lot of the shots in the gallery. It's a small beach, which is good for foreground, mid-ground, background. It has a lot of really interesting foreground elements. There's all sorts of rocks which are submerged under the sand, and depending on the time of the year, the sand is removed by the winter storms and they're exposed. Yeah, but it's what draws me to the ocean is this sort of issue of it really is the sort of the cradle of life on this planet in a way. I mean, you look at the famous astronaut photos of Earth rising and blue marble from the late 60s when the astronauts are looking back from the moon towards Earth, and you see that the Earth as a planet is made up of ocean. It really is a watery planet. And so I guess growing up and being immersed in it from an early age, I am sort of drawn to it almost psychologically. It's sort of calming to go to the ocean and to get up very early in the morning in the dark and to be down there in bare feet on the sort of the cool sand with the sea fog, and the light is just starting to come on, and you're hunting around for a composition, and it all happens very quick in the sunrise. The sunrises are fantastic. Your sunsets are a bit more of a challenge because we've got the sun rising over the ocean in the morning here, facing east. But yeah, it's a very primal experience. I guess for the wide angle issue, I was, in my first couple of years of photography, I just stuck with the standard 24-70 equivalent sort of focal length. And I was always a bit loath to go wide. And then I started to see social media posts I guess I'm sort of imitations, this is a serious form of flattery. I saw how a lot of the seascape photographers were shooting with wide lenses and getting that very dramatic composition effect where you could get very, very close to a foreground element, so 2-3 inches. And then because you've got that wide angle, it gives you that incredible field of view. And the trick is really finding that composition that allows you to project depth through the image. And plus, sunrises, you've got these incredible vivid skies. And, early on it was all about chasing the vivid burning sky. I've now got to the stage where I'm thinking, maybe I'd rather have less colour, less saturation in the sky, and maybe go for something a little bit more ethereal and that sort of thing. But yeah, the wide angle, I love the wide angle. It just gives you this incredible sort of perspective, and I've used it a lot. I bought a wide angle lens before a family trip to Europe. Actually, we went to Spain and Italy just before COVID, and walking around Venice or walking around Barcelona with a wide angle lens first thing in the morning at night, it's just fantastic because you've got that dramatic effect and it captures so much of the scene. Having said that, I do use telephotos a lot too. Don't do that much of the intimate landscapes, but telephoto to zoom in on a wave pattern or something hitting the rocks is always fun too. But yeah, my go-to is the sort of the wide angle for the landscapes. I'm guilty of that.
No, it's I feel like every time I go to the ocean, the first thing I'm drawn to is wildlife, like birds and things like that. But then once I'm good with that, then I'm like, okay, time to get the wide angle out and maybe play around a little bit with some neutral density filters and stuff like that. So
yeah, flow. Yeah,
it's a lot
playing with the flow. Yeah,
it's a lot of fun.
I love doing that. Yeah, because the thing with the seaside, the seascapes is, and it's similar, I guess, with other landscape, but seascapes particularly, it's always changing. It's almost by the millisecond, the swell, the wave pattern, the tide, your exposure settings, how fast or slow you go. You can basically sort of take all of the movement out altogether. You go to sort of 6, 10, 20-second exposures. But if you're down to that sort of, my sweet spot's sort of around that sort of fifth of a second sort of speed, and you've got a little bit of movement, but it's also got that ethereal smoothing out effect. And I'll often bracket the shots just to play with that, just to see what I can come up with. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say 1/6 is kind of my go-to.
Yeah.
Well, that was a great introduction. Let's get into the meat of this conversation, and why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this is probably going to be a little different from your regular guests, and perhaps that's the value I can add in this conversation. So, as I mentioned, for the last 20 years of my academic career, I've been researching, teaching, public speaking about climate change. I work actually in a business school at the University of Sydney. So when I say that, people say, oh, climate change, you're in a business school. I say, yeah, but it is, in my opinion, and I think a lot of scientists would agree with me, it is the biggest issue we probably face as a species in coming decades and the rest of this century. And it will affect businesses in very profound ways, as I've sort of stressed in the research and the teaching. So a lot of the research focuses on how businesses and governments have contributed to and responded to this issue of human-induced climate disruption. You know, the burning of fossil fuels, greenhouse gas emissions, warming the planet, and the myriad impacts that leads to. So I got into this research in the mid-2000s. I was interviewing senior corporate people in big multinational companies, mining companies, consumer goods, airlines, all the well-known companies. And at that time, climate change was becoming a bit of an issue for them in terms of, well, there's a physical risk to their infrastructure and their operations, supply chains, but also there's the regulatory risk that governments at that time were making a lot of noise about the need to price carbon emissions. You know, they had the Stern report in the UK, Al Gore's movie had come out, Inconvenient Truth, 2007. So there was a lot of attention to this issue. In reality, it wasn't that novel. The science of climate change goes back a century and a half. Big global corporations like ExxonMobil and that had known about what was going on in the 60s. There were letters to US presidents about the greenhouse effect. But it was starting to get traction. And so I was interviewing these senior managers, CEOs, this new breed of what were called sustainability managers that was new back then. And a lot of them were very personally quite concerned about this issue. They were personally often quite green, but they had to temper that within their professional role of maximising shareholder value and all that stuff. So that was how it started. And then over the years, I've just continued that research, looking at how essentially the big issue, the US writer Elizabeth Kolbert summed it up as, how can it be that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself? That's essentially what she sort of argued in the book. And that's the sort of the conundrum for me and my colleagues, that we know this is a big issue. It's caused by us. It's potentially catastrophic, and yet the level of action is quite muted. And so trying to analyse why that's happened is really what a lot of our research is about, the sort of the politics and the debate and how these things are framed. And I do that in my research and teaching. So, yeah, that's the day job, which is quite grim and depressing at times.
I'm pretty sure it was a episode of Hidden Brain, which was one of my favorite podcasts. And he was interviewing a climate scientist up in Alaska, and they were talking about this problem, the fact that people understand that it's a problem, but nobody's actually doing anything to change it, right? Like there's this huge disconnect between what our values are and what our beliefs are and like what our actions are. And it's really fascinating to see that disconnect play out and continue to play out.
Yeah, well, it's sociologically fascinating that is happening. And then, as a human being and a father and all of that, it's also horrifying. And I teach a lot of students in their 20s and 30s, and I have to calibrate my messaging because I don't want to put them into sort of paroxysms of eco-anxiety and, that we're all stuffed type thing, because they're young people hoping to have families, etc. But on the other hand, it is pretty grim. You look at the science and you look at the data, and what is it? Atmospheric carbon concentrations are above 420 parts per million. They were 280 pre-industrial. The rate of biodiversity collapse is at levels that's never been seen. We're living in a climate that hasn't really been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And so the pace of change is quite horrifying in a way. And so, yeah, this is the sort of the research I do. And where I'm trying to get to is, in the last 4 or 5 years, link some of my interest in photography to some of that stuff, which is not easy given the sort of industry I work in.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. I mean, how does your research inform your approach to making photographs?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. I think one of the ways it affects it is an awareness of the literature and the debates about what humans are doing, what human civilization is doing to the planet, the ecosystem, the planetary boundaries. I'm sort of familiar with all of that stuff. And as I was saying, it can be pretty grim and daunting when you delve into that literature. We've breached 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. Many scientists argue we're sort of moving towards tipping points beyond which we can't come back. The melting of Greenland and Antarctic glaciers, what's happening to the Amazon, all of these sort of tipping point type issues. And so on one hand, my photography, I guess, is doing that traditional thing of trying to capture the beauty of nature type thing, the sort of stuff that Ansel Adams and others have done. On the other hand, it's almost like bearing witness, I guess, to some of the environmental destruction. And I'll come to a project later that speaks to that more directly. Yeah, I think my research has made me much more aware of how perilous a situation is in terms of our relationship to ecosystems and biodiversity and life on the planet. And so the pivot to sort of wildlife, nature, landscape photography is a sort of an attempt by me to get closer to that issue. But it is tough because once you have that knowledge, it's what's the line from Aldo Leopold about the ecologist burden? You see a world of wounds, I think is his term, a world of wounds, because once you know what's going on, you sort of see beyond the beauty and you think, well, this is actually quite endangered. This might not be here next year. We were, just as an example, just the last few days, I was with some fellow photographers. They're hardcore bird photographers, and we travelled about an hour and a half up the coast to a part of the Central Coast where these rainbow bee-eater birds come in. They migrate in. There's incredibly coloured little birds, and they travel south to dig in the sand to breed and procreate. And there's a spot we'd been to last year where it's pretty easy to get good shots of them, big telephoto lenses and all that stuff. And they're just the most incredible looking bird. They're vivid turquoise and yellow and orange and black, and they feed on insects. We got there, and it's next to a new housing development, and they'd fenced off, this fence wasn't there, they'd fenced off this area, big signs, private property development in progress, and the bit of land that we had filmed last year had been bulldozed. And we just looked and went, oh, it's just like, what can you do? Now, they're migratory birds, and I don't know if any birds were killed in the process or anything like that, but it was a bit of a reality check that moment. So I guess there's this tension in photographic nature and landscape because you're aware of the loss and the suffering. It does become a bit of a psychological burden as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because going back to that Hidden Brain episode, because it's such a gradual thing, like it sneaks up on you and you don't like take action. It's not like today it's 65 degrees and pleasant and tomorrow it's 900 degrees. It's not like that, right? It's this super gradual, just kind of picks away at things. But I think photographers are kind of on the front line because if you get familiar with landscapes and different places and different animals and you go back to those places and those species over and over again to photograph them, you become very acutely aware of the changes that are happening out there through the lens because you see it, right? And the general public doesn't see it the same way that we do. And so I feel like on one hand, like you're saying, it's like this burden that we carry, but on the other hand, a lot of the people that I talk to feel like I need to do something with this knowledge, right? So where does that leave you? Like, what are some of the things that you're trying to do with the burden of knowledge that you're carrying around?
Yeah, just on the time scale, it's an interesting one because, yeah, you're right. In terms of human time scales, it's very hard to capture an awareness of climate disruption. We see it in extreme weather events, the fires that are happening. And I think there's fires in Los Angeles at the moment happening. There's certainly been a lot of fires over your summer in Canada and those sort of places. And we have this bizarre phenomenon where, because we're Southern Hemisphere, in our summers, we had the Black Summer fires in 2019, 2020, where most of Eastern Australia was on fire. Billions of animals were just killed. We lost, I can't remember the statistics, umpteen hectares of forest, etc. We've been lucky to avoid another Black Summer in the last few summers. But there's this phenomenon of almost swapping firefighters across the Pacific, because when California's burning, we're exporting our firefighters to you guys. And then when we're burning, they come out here to help us. So there's these extreme weather events and we capture that. But so much of the media frames that as, well, let's not talk about climate change. Now's not the time, thoughts and prayers type stuff. Or, the typhoons, the wild storms, these things. So we see the extreme weather events. We don't necessarily make the connection to climate change because that plays out over geological time, over generations. But if you look at the deep history of the planet, at the pace of climate disruption we're seeing now is unparalleled in the geological record. I mean, the Permian extinction, where I think 95% of life on Earth was made extinct, occurred over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and we're doing a similar level of disruption in a century and a half. So, when you look at the deep history, it's kind of scary, the time frames. But you're right, it's very hard for human society because we're busy, we're focused to sort of be focused on that. And that analogy of the boiling frog, I think it's an urban myth. The frog's in the water and you gradually heat it up and they just sit there boiling. I gather they jump out before that happens, but anyway. Yeah, there's that. But getting back to your question about how photographers are sort of on the front line, yeah, we are. We're sort of, like a lot of ecologists and people who are concerned with nature, you're aware of this, you notice these changes, and you can advocate for change in some ways. So photography, I think, is in a good space for this, because I was thinking about this last night. The role of visual imagery can be quite powerful in communicating issues to the general public. I use a lot of visual imagery in my teaching and my lectures. In fact, most of my lectures are just visual images with maybe 1 or 2 words of text, and then I just riff on that in the classes, which perhaps drives some of my students a bit mad because they like to have lecture notes and things. But the power of the image, the power of a story in an image, is something that we're almost hardwired to focus on and accept and embed at a very deep level. So I was thinking about, if you look at the classic sort of photographers that have championed nature, the Ansel Adams, those sort of photographers have been voices for the environment. I think Ansel Adams played a big role in nature conservation in the US around national parks and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think there's the potential to do that. The caveat I'd say to that, though, is that in recent years we've become so saturated through social media and other things that I'm not sure the visual image has the power that it used to have. I use the example in one of my lectures. We look at the example of photojournalism and the impact of those pretty graphic images from the Vietnam War. I was looking at the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War the other night, and that famous shot of the Buddhist monk self-immolating in Saigon against the French occupation, or what's the image, Napalm Girl. Those incredibly powerful images that really completely changed American public opinion about the war. Today, I don't know if those images would have the same effect, because we're just saturated with imagery, and it's the spectacle. It becomes the spectacle. It doesn't have that sort of level of impact. So I'm hoping, photojournalists, nature photographers can have that impact on public consciousness and get people concerned about climate and the environment and biodiversity. But I'm also worried that we're so saturated with imagery that it just washes over us now, what washes over for many people.
Well, I mean, you're on the front lines educating the up-and-coming youth at the university. I'm curious, in what ways are you able to kind of blend your photography with your research and how you're teaching these topics with the students that you're with?
Yeah, so as I said, I use a lot of imagery in my lectures, and my own and others, with suitable credits. There's some marvelous images that work so well in the space around sort of environmental issues. So, you've got the very famous ecological disasters, the Exxon Valdez in Alaska in the mid-'80s, the big oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster. You've got these very graphic shots of when stuff goes bad, big oil spills, big disasters. But then there's the sort of the personal stories I think work much more powerfully in communicating issues. So there's a marvelous image I think Dan Winters took for National Geographic of this young lady who's been sort of immortalized in The Simpsons and a lot of other places. What's her name? Jessica Butterfly Hill, Julia Butterfly Hill, I think her name is. And she basically climbed up one of the sequoias in Humboldt County in the 1980s, 90s, can't remember. And she lived up in this tree for like a year and a half, basically, with loggers trying to harass her and get her down from this tree. And it was in protest about the logging that was happening there in Northern California. And this image that Dan Winters shot, I think, is of her clinging to this tree. She's sort of wild, her hair's flowing in the background, and she's wearing this sort of furry type outfit. She looks like, she is the literal tree hugger. She looks like sort of a primate clinging to this tree. But it's just the most fantastic image. And I show that to my students. They just go, wow, you know, and you tell them the story behind that image. And they remember that. They remember that much better than if I give them a long hour-long lecture on the science of forestry and wilderness destruction or something. So weaving those stories in, linking them to an image, and then that's the way to sort of segue to the bigger issue. And that really resonates, I think, with the students.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, because I've found that there's a lot of photographers out there that are looking to blend their passion for landscape photography with the desire to make a difference in the world, especially around climate and the environment and saving the species that we do have left. What advice would you have for people who find themselves in that camp?
Yeah, look, it's tough because I guess a lot of landscape photographers who are doing it professionally, they're trying to make an income from it, and that's really tough given the market pressures that are obvious in terms of, you know, social media and iPhones and artificial intelligence, all this stuff. I realize I don't do this, but I realize if you're trying to make a living out of landscape photography, it must be very, very difficult to do that on a consistent basis. And then weave into that, you want to have some impact on preserving nature, conservation, perhaps challenging big politically contentious issues. You know, climate change is a partisan political issue, as is obvious in the US, and it's very similar in Australia. It's a left-right political issue, you know, belief in climate change. It's this polarizing thing. So if you try to bring that in, there's the danger you're going to marginalize some of your audience, potentially antagonize people because it is so loaded politically. But on the other hand, you know, there's the personal commitment to try and save the natural world, or at least, you know, preserve some of it. What advice could I do around that? I think perhaps find an aspect of nature conservation that is real and immediate to you, that you're very familiar with, and work there rather than trying to cover the whole space. Some of the people who do this really well, there's a marvelous documentary series on Netflix called Photographer. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and Dan Winters is in that. I'm just trying to remember the other photographers there. There's Paul Nicklin, I think. And there's a whole emphasis on his work as a nature wildlife photographer, but he's also trying to speak to bigger issues. And I think the example I used in the doco was he's in a boat with his partner, who's also a fantastic photographer, and they're trying to get shots of this big oil exploration rig in the Gulf, I think, of Mexico. And there's all sorts of logistical problems of getting the shot, but it's all about getting the shot, right? Because if you can get the shot, it will hopefully bring awareness at a public level and change minds and shape politics, perhaps, and limit some of this extractive activity. You know, one of the great examples of this and the impact of the imagery is the History of Greenpeace, the environmental NGO, which, you know, started in the late 60s, early 70s in Vancouver for long-haired hippie-type guys, and they went up to Kamchatka to protest against the nuclear test there. But the phrase that really captured me in this doco about them was that the founder of the four of them said, we've got to get these viral images, and he called them mind bombs. If we can get these mind bombs, these viral images, they will capture public attention, and people will change their attitudes and put pressure on politicians to stop whaling or stop forestry or sealing or whatever it was. And I really liked that. The example they used in the video I saw was this image they needed to get of, there were, at the time, the 70s, there were Russian whaling ships whaling, harpooning whales not far off the Californian coast, apparently. And they wanted to get a shot of a Zodiac, a rubber ducky sort of thing, in between the whaling ship and the whale with the harpoon flying over the top. And it's quite fun watching them trying to get this shot. And did you get the shot? Yeah, we got the shot. And that was quite a powerful image. So there's the potential to have real impact as a nature photographer here. I think if you can get images that tell that story about perhaps environmental destruction or species at risk or whatever it might be, and if there's a powerful image to leverage off that and then tell that story, that's how I think you can have a broader impact.
Yeah, and as you were talking, it occurred to me that probably the best advice I would have for somebody is to just start super local with something that you care about. So like you were talking about these birds that nest on the beach that's not too far from where you live, and you could probably write up a 2,000 word essay and use some photos and talk about how this housing development has impacted the climate of this bird and things like that. And who knows, maybe that would inspire some city councils to implement some kind of checks and balance system where they do some kind of environmental impact assessment before they actually approve a new building project or something like that. So it seems like going local is probably the best and most feasible way to start.
Yeah, totally. I think you can't hope to capture everything. You need something that is, as you say, local, specific, that tells us sort of a fairly simple story, and off that you can leverage something more significant. Another example in Australia would be quite a famous example. Peter Dombrovskis, very famous sort of nature landscape photographer in Tasmania, and he did these iconic images of the Franklin River in the late 70s, early 80s. At the time, there was a proposal by the Tasmanian Hydroelectric Commission to dam the Franklin. They were building a whole lot of hydroelectric dams. And there was a massive environmental campaign against this. And that Dombrovskis photo of the Franklin River, it's this iconic image, featured in a lot of the campaigning that led eventually to an incoming government to prohibit the Tasmanian government from damming the Franklin. That's sort of gone down in Australian environmental history as one of the big ones. Another one that comes to mind is, and I think you've had Paul Holan on your podcast.
Yeah.
And he with a group of colleagues did a fantastic book. It's called Black and Blue. I've got it here somewhere, where they were doing aerial photography around the Great Barrier Reef. And, it's a gift. You're up in a plane looking at the Great Barrier Reef and there's just miles of fantastic reef and patterns and colours. And then they contrasted that with aerial photography not very far away of the Bowen Basin coal mines. And again, fantastic images, patterns and colours, but then you realise this is sort of extractivism which is endangering that reef that is not very far away. And in fact, I've got a research project looking at coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef, which I've tried to weave some photo images in, but we can talk about the problems I have with visual imagery and academic publication. That's quite complex, that one.
Yeah, really. Well, maybe this is a really good segue for you to talk about the project that you've been working on. You've got a gallery on your website called Toxic Sublime, which showcases the paradoxical beauty caused by human destruction of the natural world. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing on that project.
Yeah, no, thanks, Matt. This is an interesting one. I had for some years been, as a sort of a sideline, this is where the research sort of influenced the photography. I've been driving around taking shots of big fossil fuel extraction sites, so big open cut coal mines. 2 hours north of Sydney, we have the Port of Newcastle. It's the largest coal port in the world. And there's a massive coal handling facility there. And I was sort of taking telephoto shots of these massive coal wheels that they sort of grab the coal and put it on a conveyor and put it on a ship. I'd been taking shots of big coal-fired power stations. So these were sort of your classic, almost photojournalistic type shots of fossil fuel infrastructure. And I use them in my teaching and when I do public talks. They show on the screen behind me when I'm talking about my research. And they're quite powerful, high contrast, high colour type images. But I enrolled in a course with the Centre for Contemporary Photography in Melbourne. And it was all about learning narrative storytelling in environmental photography. I thought, well, this is sort of up my alley. I signed up for this. And we have a research project looking at how different industries are seeking to adapt to climate impacts. And one of the case studies I'm leading is the Great Barrier Reef and coral bleaching stuff. So I thought this could be useful skills to learn for this research project. And the lady who was running the project is a National Geographic photographer. And I'll I'll highlight her name later, Michaela Skowronova. And she was basically saying, I want you to develop a photo project for this course. Yeah, okay. And I was thinking, what could I do? And I'd heard about these coal ash waste sites, again, north, not far from the bird photography spot, actually, around Lake Macquarie, sort of 2 hours drive north of Sydney. We have a lot of coal-fired power stations that are getting very old and are sort of shutting down. And the backstory here is that when you use coal to produce power, you have to sort of mulch it all up to create a powder. You then incinerate it. It generates an awful lot of heat, which boils water, which creates steam, which turns a turbine, which produces electricity. Very 19th century technology for producing electricity. But Australia is highly dependent on coal-fired power because we've got a lot of coal. And once you burn that coal, you have a lot of ash, a lot of coal ash. And what we've tended to do, and it's the case in the US and pretty well all around the world, next to coal-fired power stations, you have these massive coal ash waste sites. Ours were built in the 60s, 70s and 80s. They're unlined, they're uncapped. So there's millions and millions of tons of coal ash just sitting there in these massive fields. And I'd seen some local people had done some drone photography up there. And I thought, well, this could be a project. So I have a drone. It's just a sort of consumer drone. And I scoped out on Google Earth where these spots were. And I had to launch my drone from public space. So I had to fly it into these spaces. I couldn't go on private land. And they're prohibited sites. You can't go in there. They're fenced off for security for good reason. They're highly toxic sites. You wouldn't want to just stomp in there with your camera. And so I started taking drone shots of these coal ash waste sites. And what I quickly discovered was there's this really interesting tension between the aesthetic beauty of these sites when they're viewed at sunset from above in a drone. Massive colours, fantastic colour contrast, patterns, because the groundwater, the rain causes these little rivulets, which cause these patterns of vegetation and structure. So visually, they're quite rich. But the tension is that you realise that they're also toxic waste sites, right? They're destruction of nature. So I started thinking about this, and I discovered there's an academic at Utah State University, Jennifer Peoples, who'd come up with this term toxic sublime. So it's not my term, it's her term. And it's a really cute sort of use of language because she'd written these essays analysing very famous photographers like Edward Batinsky, and he'd done these fantastic shots of tar sand sites in Canada and big industrial mines. And she pointed out that what his photography was doing was celebrating the majesty and power and awe of these sites, the sublime. The natural sublime is the wonder and awe of Yosemite National Park or whatever it is. The toxic sublime is the shock and awe of these sites, but realizing these are sites of extraction and the destruction of nature. So it's this sort of duality thing. And so I chatted to Jennifer about this and showed her some of the shots. She said, yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. That's the toxic sublime in action sort of thing. So that's how the project developed. There's about, I think, 20, 25 shots on the gallery on my website. And they're just a plethora of different colours and patterns shot at different sites at different times of day. But yeah, they're toxic. I mean, those sites, the coal ash concentrates arsenic, cadmium, mercury. There's some radioactive trace elements there. It's not good stuff. And it poses a toxic hazard to the communities that live nearby as well, of course.
And you've got another gallery that I saw in there that was, I can't remember the exact title, but it's showcasing, I think the way you phrased it was humanity's obsession or addiction to fossil fuels or something like that.
I used a bit of alliteration. I think I called it fossil fuel fetish. A lot of F's there.
Yes, that was it. Yes.
Yeah, and there's shots of that fossil fuel infrastructure, the big coal loading facilities, the ships, the coal mines. There's real problems in photographing that stuff logistically because, as I said, climate change is politically contentious. A lot of environmental activists target these sites. The companies correspondingly push back with security, prohibit drone flights, understandably, I guess, it's their private property. They don't want people coming in, and they certainly don't want these things being publicised if the take is particularly negative or critical. So I can understand their perspective. But yeah, the reality is Australia is one of the world's leading petrostates. We're the world's largest exporter of coal and gas, a bit like the US, a bit like Canada, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, et cetera. So we are a key part of the world's addiction to fossil energy, and I'm trying to sort of capture that and document that to some extent. And whether that has any impact on public policy, I don't know. It probably doesn't, but it's certainly useful for teaching and research. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you familiar with a photographer named J. Henry Fair?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
in fact, he's one of the ones that is in that sort of toxic sublime grouping. So it'd be Edward Batinsky, David Maysel, J. Henry Fair, and he's done shots, marvellous. I've got his book just here, actually. Marvellous shots of feedlots and abattoirs and all sorts of things.
This book right here, Industrial Scars?
That's the one. I was actually looking for that last night. It's somewhere in my book collection right here. It's a great book, yeah.
Yeah, I really recommend it for people who are interested in this particular genre. And when I was looking through your website, I was like, oh, this is a lot like J. Henry Fair. That's cool.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be great to have the money to get up in a plane and do aerial photography. Paul Holland has done that, and others. With one of the issues is big open cut coal mines. They're so big that a drone doesn't really have enough altitude to give it justice. You need to be up in an aeroplane because they're enormous. And if you go on Google Earth and look at the Hunter Valley of Australia, it's just a procession of massive open cut coal mines. Huge scale. And so to really capture that, you need to be up in an aeroplane to take the shots. Right. And people have done that. And I thought, well, they've done it probably better than I could ever do it. So I'm not going to do the open cut coal mines, but I can zero in on these coal ash waste sites because they're a little smaller. They're still pretty huge. And you've got these marvelous colors, whereas an open cut coal mine is just a big dull grey brown hole in the ground type thing.
Yeah. Well, shifting gears a little bit, but it's related. When I was looking through your website, I noticed that you seem to dabble in like lots of different genres of photography. You've got some really cool street images. You've got these environmental shots. You've got seascapes. You've got traditional landscapes, underwater photography, which you talked a little bit about. What advantages does taking that particular approach bring you as a photographer?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I'm guilty as charged. I'm pretty bad at, well, good, I don't know what the analogy is, but I jump around a lot in terms of styles of photography. And truth is, I get sort of bored after a while, taking shots of beaches at sunrise. I've sort of done that to death. I will still continue to do it. I'm not going to stop. But one of the things I've discovered is I've gone down this photographic sort of journey is once you get into the technical aspects of it, there's all sorts of new challenges that emerge once you sort of get tickled by some new genre. So macro photography, for instance, I got into that sort of last year. There was a sale on. I saw a macro lens that I sort of fancied. I thought, yeah, I'll get one of those. And then I discovered, well, you don't only need a lens, you need a flash, and then you need a diffuser. And then, you go down another rabbit hole. And you watch lots of YouTube videos of people who are just hardcore macro and they shoot bugs and stuff. And so I went down that path, and that was a lot of fun. And then another, I mentioned bird photography. Again, massive telephoto lenses. You've got the challenge of very high shutter speeds. What do you do with ISO? The lenses and cameras are heavy, so you've got to stand there waiting for a bird to take off or something. You're holding this camera waiting for the damn thing to take off. Press the shutter and he's too quick. You've missed it type thing.
Well, it just makes you stronger.
Yeah, you need arms like Arnold Schwarzenegger with some of these lenses. But yeah, so bird photography, macro, underwater. There's a technical challenge in each of them. I really enjoy learning new stuff. And all of those, I guess, what brings them together, perhaps less the street photography, although I have done a lot of environmental protests and things, is that there's a common theme of environmentalism within it somewhere. So the underwater stuff I was doing up in the Great Barrier Reef, that was part of a research trip. We were looking at coral bleaching, political responses to coral bleaching. Great Barrier Reef's bleached badly about 4 or 5 times over the last 10 years. It's become a big political public issue. Been a lot of pressure for UNESCO to list the GBR as endangered by climate disruption. A lot of political pushback against that. So as part of that research, I researched a lot of interviews with marine tourism operators and stuff up there. But we thought we should get out in the reef and see it. So we've done a couple of trips out there out of Port Douglas with a really good group, small sort of group of divers, and it's all snorkeling, it's not scuba. And I thought, well, I should take a camera, and I wasn't going to buy a big housing for my camera and all that stuff. So I just bought a little Olympus TG6 sort of underwater point and shoot. Very good camera. Shoots raw, only 12 megapixel, but fantastic images you get. And it was fun because the tour operators take you to different sites on the reef, and what you realise is the bleaching is not uniform. It hits particular parts of the reef really badly, and then other parts escape because of water flow and currents and stuff. They take you to one spot where it's been completely decimated, dating back to the 2016 bleaching, and it's rubble and algae, and it looks terrible. There's no fish. You go to a second site, and it's a little bit better, a few more fish. You can start to see branch coral and brain coral, and it's looking pretty good. And then the piece de resistance is at the end. They take you to this third spot where there's this great channel that leads out to the ocean, where the ocean water was pumping through at the time of the bleaching. A lot of circulating water. And it's what the reef used to look like 30 years ago. It's just magic. There's massive parrotfish and red bass, coral trout. There's sharks, there's turtles, there's all sorts of coral and colours. And, you're just clicking away madly. And there was one bit where there were these clownfish, the Nemos, right? And they're down in an anemone about 20 feet down. And I'm not a free diver. I'm trying to learn how to do that. Have great trouble getting down to depth. But I thought, I'm going to get down there and get a shot of this Nemo. So it took about 20 attempts, but I eventually got down there. And then the trick is you can't see what you're shooting. You're not looking through a viewfinder. You're looking at an LCD screen. And I was just clicking away madly. 20 attempts, I thought, I've got to have got a shot of the Nemo in that. And I was looking at the viewfinder. Oh, yes, there's one. And it's in focus. So mission accomplished.
That's awesome. Yeah, my understanding is the coral reefs are kind of like a canary in the coal mine when it comes to the impacts of climate change, because it really does showcase what can happen when the ocean temperature reaches a certain threshold. And I think what people don't understand about the marine ecology, and again, I'm just like a nerd, so I don't know everything, but I know a little bit. And my understanding is like basically what happens is the water gets really hot because it's taking on carbon and it's getting warmer and warmer because of the jet stream and things like that. And then because of that high temperature, it bleaches and it kills off the coral because it can't survive at that temperature. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean, the oceans absorb around 80 to 90% of the warming that we've contributed to the atmosphere. So the oceans are this massive heat sink, and they're getting warmer and warmer. And if you look at the NOAA data on the oceans, particularly the Atlantic, this last Northern Hemisphere summer, they've reached levels never seen before. It's been right off the chart, literally off the charts in terms of temperature increase. So as the oceans warm, this poses a threat to coral reefs all around the world. And there's been terrible bleaching this year, 2024, in the Caribbean, the Maldives, the GBR, Great Barrier Reef as well. So we're seeing much more intense coral bleaching events and more frequent. As the planet warms, the oceans warm, the corals reach a point where they can't adapt to those temperatures. And it is highly variable depending on ocean currents at the time. And if a cyclone or a hurricane comes through, that can circulate the water a bit more and cool them down. But essentially, the physics of it, as you sort of outlined, is that the ocean's warm. The coral lives in a symbiotic relationship with algae, a particular type of algae called zoolanthe, I think it's called. And the algae provides food and colour for the coral. So the fact that the corals are coloured is due to the algae that live within the coral exoskeleton. So it's just, coral itself is sort of like a gelatinous, transparent jellyfish that lives within an exoskeleton of calcium carbonate. So once the corals get stressed, they expel the algae and they go white, hence the analogy bleaching. They're not actually being bleached, but they expel the algae. And then they are in a situation of risk, because unless the stressor, the ocean temperature, declines quickly within about a week, 10 days, and they can reabsorb the algae, they basically starve and die. And you're just left with that white exoskeleton, which looks like it's been bleached. You've seen it in all the images. And then that exoskeleton basically degrades and you're left with rubble and a brown slime algae that takes over. So some of those shots, the 2016, 2017 back-to-back bleaching up at Lizard Island, are pretty catastrophic. And they went all around the world on international media, and images of divers swimming over sort of acres of bleach white coral. And that was the first of the big catastrophic bleachings. We've had 4 since then, and it's probably going to get worse. I don't like to speak to marine scientists about the future for coral reefs because it's pretty grim. We're at 1.1, 1.2 degrees average global warming across the planet. And at those levels, there really isn't much of a future for coral reefs around the planet, which is a pretty scary thought.
And then the last piece of that I'm tapping into the limited knowledge that I have about the subject, but my understanding is that when the ocean gets warmer, it's a little bit more acidic, and that can prevent shellfish from developing their calcium carbonate shells, because calcium is vulnerable to more acidic pH balance. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that we get something like 2/3 of our oxygen from those creatures in the ocean that depend on that cycle of developing their calcium carbonate shell and expelling the oxygen out. And if those things stop to reproducing, then we lose literally 2/3 of our oxygen.
Yeah, look, I think the whole knowledge of how dependent humans are on functioning ecosystems and a habitable climate passes many people by, and politicians certainly don't talk about it. Yeah, that's a great example. So yes, you're right. The other side effect of pumping massive amounts of greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, into the atmosphere and changing the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere is that as the oceans absorb heat, they also absorb the carbon. And so the world's oceans are 30% more acidic than they were pre-industrial. And that has an impact on marine food chains because the small microorganisms, the krill and the shell-bearing sort of organisms are finding it harder to exist in a more acidic ocean. And again, it's not uniform across the planet. There are particular parts of the world where ocean acidification is going to be much more profound. The Pacific Northwest of the US is one of those hotspots for ocean acidification. Yeah, so that's even more grim. And I guess the other thing, once you start reading into the science of ecology and nature, is the realization that everything's interlinked. It's complex systems and feedback loops. And a concept I use a lot in my lectures and my teaching is this idea of trophic cascades, which is the idea that ecosystems are embedded systems within which species and energy flows are all interlinked. There's a great example of this with the reintroduction of the wolf into Yellowstone National Park that people are probably familiar with. And the wolf had sort of been hunted to extinction. It was reintroduced to Yellowstone, I think, in the 80s or the 90s. And suddenly you started to see that the prey species, the elk and that, started to change their feeding patterns. That led to the rebound of forests and bushes in certain parts. A whole sort of cascade of species came back, rodents, which brought in birds, beavers, all this sort of stuff happened. And the punchline, essentially, a very well-known video that sort of does the rounds in ecological circles, was that the wolves actually changed the path of rivers because the trees were regrowing and the rivers were undulating much more. So it's a really quite a cute example of how ecosystems are these complex systems that we often don't even understand the harm we're doing when we put a bulldozer through a forest or whatever it is.
Yeah, and for the people who are listening and they're like, I thought this was a photography podcast. My thing is like, even if you find yourself in that camp of individuals that thinks climate science is a hoax, or that it's all like climate change is natural, whatever, my thought is, okay, that could be true. Even if you believe that, it seems like we all love photographing nature, and we love to photograph these beautiful things that we love to see outside. And if that's what you love about photography, it seems to me like you would want to do whatever was in your power to protect and preserve your ability to continue to capture those things. And I think by educating yourself and becoming aware of these things, and then by trying to take action to make sure that these things are decelerating, I think you have to hit people where it counts, and that's with themselves usually. So just saying.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, if you love the nature, you love the outdoors, you love going out for walks in the wild, down at the ocean, you want to see those places preserved in some way. You don't want to see them destroyed. And unfortunately, the way in which human society has evolved in the last 150 years, we've put an enormous burden on the natural world that we're only starting to realize the consequences of now. I mean, it's what's that great Joni Mitchell line, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Big Yellow Taxi, I think's the song. And It's just so true. You know, we take so much for granted about a functioning ecosystem, a functioning climate, and we don't really know what we've got till it's gone. You know, there's going to be some pretty profound, in my opinion, some pretty profound realizations occurring in coming decades about how much we've imperiled our own existence in the destruction of the natural world.
I don't know if you're familiar with Pascal's wager. It's a philosophical perspective on the belief of a higher power. And essentially, and I'm an atheist just saying that, but like Pascal's wager essentially was, you know, we don't really know if there's a God. And even if you don't think there's a God, it seems to me that betting against there not being an afterlife is probably not the best idea. And I think using Pascal's wager when it comes to climate science and environmentalism, I think is a very good analogy, because it's like, okay, even if you're wrong about climate science, like I'm talking to you, Chris, like if you're wrong, the impacts of everyone else changing their behavior is pretty minimal, versus if you're right about climate change and we don't change our behavior, it's going to be catastrophic. So it seems to me like the logical choice would be to choose the one that is the most logical wager, right? So anyway.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the other analogy there would be the precautionary principle, you know.
I'm not familiar with this one.
Well, the idea, if you're in doubt, there's a chance that harm could be caused by some certain action. You basically decide not to engage in that, you know, because the consequences of it causing harm are so catastrophic, it's just not worth the risk. It's sort of like risk management 101, the precautionary principle. And it strikes me with the sort of things we're talking about, the disruption to a habitable climate, the destruction of biodiversity and the functioning of ecosystems, which we are all so dependent on in terms of our economy, our society, our very physical existence. The precautionary principle should apply. What's the worst going to happen? Well, we could end up with a cleaner environment and nature to enjoy. What's the worst that could happen? Well, we could extinguish life on the planet type thing. So not wanting to catastrophize, but the downside risk is pretty significant, I think, in terms of where we are at this stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not to beleaguer the point, but it's for people who think climate science is not real, why don't you just ask an insurance estimator, like the people that actually their livelihood depends on accurately estimating how much risk is involved in insuring a property, let's say in certain areas that are being more and more impacted by hurricanes, typhoons, things like that. Like insurance companies know way more about climate science than almost anyone else, because their entire business model depends on getting it right. And they're hedging their bets towards every year it getting more and more expensive to continue to insure some of these places. So just putting that out there, like people with a capitalist mindset already know that this is a challenge.
Yeah, no, and our research, our interviews with CEOs, and in fact, we case studies of insurers and reinsurers on this, and you speak to people in those organisations, the sort of modelling they're doing, because they can't rely on historical records anymore. It's a new normal. And a lot of those people are pretty worried about where we're heading. And they're voting with their dollars in terms of getting out of risky investments. Yeah.
Right. Well, Chris, maybe last main thing I wanted to ask you about was the book that you've written. So tell us about your climate change book. I know it's not photography, but I would love for you to tell our listeners about the book that you've published.
Yeah, we've done a couple of books, actually. We did one in 2015, and we've done one more recently, came out last year. And it focuses on that conundrum that Elizabeth Kolbert talked about. You know, why isn't there action? Why, given the potential to destroy a lot of what we take for granted, why isn't there more focus amongst businesses and governments? And so the books basically explore that, and sort of through an analysis of big corporations and industry association governments, we sort of outline how it is that the issue is framed in ways such that no action really happens. It is bizarre when you think about it. As I was saying early on, you know, those letters to President Johnson in the 60s and President Nixon in the 70s from staffers saying, well, there's this thing called the greenhouse effect, and it could, you know, endanger major American cities. We should probably do something about this. And I show these letters in my lectures, and it gets a lot of laughs because it's sort of bizarre that we're looking at this. But yeah, So we've known about this for decades, 40, 50 years politically, and yet there's just this lack of action. So the books really sort of unpack how has that happened? What are the processes through which vested interests, primarily the fossil fuel industries, have created doubt about the science, created political movements of denial about climate change, and how that's played out at different levels in society. So we focus on this sort of idea of the politics of mitigation, climate mitigation, the debates about reducing carbon emissions, the politics of climate adaptation, the debates about how can we adapt, do we adapt, who gets to adapt, who doesn't, winners and losers in that sort of space around flooding of cities and extreme weather events and insurance you've raised. And then lastly, the politics of suffering, because there is already large parts of the world that are going through pretty catastrophic impacts from climate, particularly in the global south and the developing world. And we see these in our news feeds, disasters, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, I think it was. And it's basically sort of caring at a distance. We see it in our news feeds, but we think, oh, that's other people. We don't have to worry about that. We'll be okay type thing. So that's what the book's really sort of focused on. And one of the themes I was thinking about this discussion was, how do I get my photography to engage with some of that stuff? And the biggest problem really for me is that I live in an academic ecosystem where the focus is on publish or perish in big peer-reviewed journals. They're text-based outputs. They're not really interested in images. And yet I think there's so much that images about this issue and the environment could do in communicating this. And clearly academic publishing isn't the space for that, but perhaps more popular outlets like blogging and writing articles and pitching stuff to National Geographic, that could be a more productive space to do some of this stuff. And I suppose I've got some skills now in photography, and I've certainly got a lot of skills around climate and environmental science and politics. So I'd like to sort of bring those together in a more productive way. But I'm still working on that. It's a work in progress.
I love it. What's the title of the latest book?
Organising Responses to Climate Change: The Politics of Mitigation, Adaptation and Suffering. And it's produced by Cambridge University Press.
Love it. We'll put that in the show notes. All right. Last question, Chris. Who do you recommend for the podcast? Who are some photographers that our listeners need to learn more about?
Yeah, well, look, I was going to go with a number of names, and some of you've already had on the show. So I was going to mention Will Patino and Serena Dennis, but you've already had them on the show. So there's three others I thought I'd suggest. They're people that I've come into contact with who shoot with similar camera systems to what I use. So I've actually learned a lot from them about that. The first is Michaela Skowronova. She was the young lady who ran the course around storytelling and photography. She's done a lot of work with National Geographic and other big US publications, and her work is sort of environmental photojournalism, and it's really atmospheric, and I think she'd be a really interesting one to speak to because of that sort of interface between publishing in big outlets, but also having a sort of very artistic photojournalistic approach to nature and wildlife. The second person I'd suggest is a Belgian guy who's lived in Australia a fair bit. Chris Walker is his name. And again, he does a lot of sort of landscape, but also other types of photography. And again, I think he's an OM ambassador. This is the camera system I use. So he's been quite useful to talk to about the specifics of the camera system and the lenses and what you can do with them and the advantages and disadvantages they have. So Chris Walker would be a good one to talk to. And then the last one is a British landscape photographer, again, another OM photographer, Phil Norton. And he does some fantastic landscape photography, I think up in the north of England, Yorkshire, that sort of way. But he's also produced some fantastic technical manuals on how to get the most out of the OM cameras that I use and lenses. And so there's a lot of technical stuff I've learned from him around using filters and different apertures and different sort of technical aspects of those cameras. So again, they're probably different to the sort of people you've spoken to in your podcast to date, but they might provide some more interesting sort of aspects as well.
I love it. Well, Chris, this has been awesome. First, just thank you for the work you're doing. It's very important. I think climate is, I agree with what you said at the beginning. It's our number one concern as a species. And I just want to thank you for trying to make a difference as much as in what you're doing. So thank you.
Oh, thanks, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and I discovered it during COVID on long walks out along the local beaches, put the AirPods in and listen to photography podcasts, and yours has been one of my favourites. And I love that opening theme music. So as soon as that comes on my AirPods, I think I'm going to be listening to F-Stop. It's going to be fun. So it's
Nice.
great pleasure to be invited to be on your podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you to Chris for the wonderful conversation on the podcast this week. I really appreciate you joining me for this chat and for all of your work on this important issue. If you find value in these conversations, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. Each week, we release new episodes on Patreon, and in the show notes, there are questions for you to respond to. Joining is free, but I appreciate you contributing some financial amount on Patreon if you can. Thank you to each and every one of you who already has. You're the best. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.